Hej allihopa, välkomna till kvällens Apologia live. Jag heter Martin Helgesson. Som ni antagligen har gissat av kvällens rubrik så kommer vårt program ikväll vara på engelska. Så jag kommer att byta språk här och nu. Apologia is a center for Christian apologetics, which means that we want to help both Christians and non-Christians to see how the gospel of Jesus Christ is true, good, and beautiful. And we want to do this especially in dialogue with the doubts and the criticisms that are raised against the Christian faith in our contemporary world. However, tonight, our topic is more of an in-house question or in-house debate, which concerns the area of Protestants and Roman Catholics and the Orthodox Church. So we have seen a trend in recent years where many Christians in Sweden have realized that there is a great value to having deep roots in their Christian life, both individually and corporately in the church. And for some people, realizing the value of deep roots and historical connections, this has meant a move towards the Roman Catholic Church or towards Eastern Orthodoxy. Tonight, we want to explore the question whether you have to cease to be a Protestant if you want to be deeply rooted in history, or whether Protestants can somehow claim their part in the church's history and the church's story as well. And how and why would they do that? And we are honored to have as our speaker tonight, Dr. Gavin Ortlund. Gavin Ortland is a theologian and pastor in OJ. Am I saying that right?
Almost. It's pronounced Ojai.
Ojai, of course. Thank you. Ojai is almost just too kind there. I was not even close. It's in Southern California, though. I know that. Northwest of Los Angeles.
That's right.
That's right. And Gavin has an MDiv degree from the excellent and wonderful seminary known as Covenant Theological Seminary in St. Louis, and also a PhD from Fuller Seminary in historical theology. So clearly, Gavin, you are someone who's interested in history and church history. So before you start with your presentation, I wanted to ask if you would first share something of your background, maybe how Jesus found you, and something of your work in Ojai and your family, but then also something about how you became interested in church history.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me, Martin, and for everybody on the Zoom call here. I pray that the Lord blesses you through these moments that we have together. I feel really honored to be able to talk with you all.
Okay, I think we're ready. Gavin, please talk to us about reclaiming our roots.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, let me share a few introductory comments about how I became interested in questions of the relationship between Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, and the other traditions. There's other traditions, of course, outside of those three. Let's see, it's April of 2022 as of this moment. I started a YouTube channel in August of 2020, coming up in a few months on 2 years. I mainly was doing that for an interest in apologetics. I thought there are so many young men. I was writing a book on apologetics, on the existence of God. I thought there's so many young men who are interested in philosophical and religious questions about God, about faith, but they will never come to my church. They'll never read they'll never read my book even, but they'll watch YouTube videos. And I know that because they are. YouTube is a space where things are happening for better or for worse. Even philosophical conversations are happening on YouTube. And so my main focus was on apologetics. And then I thought, well, I'll also do theology. Well, as I got into things, I began to notice four things. Number one, there's an enormous amount of energy and commitment and work being put into Catholic and Orthodox apologetics and just Catholic and Orthodox theology more generally on YouTube. And that was interesting to me because I had never really made those conversations my personal focus. I've always been interested. I maybe did one or two little studies, little forays into that. in the context of my PhD. At one point, I was looking into justification and the 1999 Joint Declaration, and I was interested in that. And I was reading the Mark Knoll, Carol Nistra book, Is the Reformation Over? So I remember that. That was, one summer I was thinking about that. And then, of course, I thought about it more from the angle of a Protestant outlook. And this led to my book, Theological Retrieval for Evangelicals, a Protestant outlook of how do we relate to the church? But that was not so much defending Protestants from other charges as much as calling Protestants to be historically rooted. So I was not previously deep in these particular conversations, but I began to notice, number one, there's so much right now, so much interest in Catholicism and Orthodoxy and the other ancient traditions. The second thing I noticed is there's not too many Protestants engaging these conversations at a high level. There are some, but I would say it's disproportionate relative to the size of the different traditions. And when Protestants do engage on questions like this, a lot of times they don't have a really good grounding in historical theology. Sometimes it's all based upon the Bible, and therefore there are some vulnerabilities and weak points in Protestant apologetics. And I would just say, if I say anything else in our time, I would just hit this point that there is just this massive need for Protestants to engage our own Protestant history and read some of the Protestant theologians of the past who spoke to these issues. And there's a massive ignorance about, for many Protestants, I think there's a lot of ignorance about why we're Protestant. What are we protesting? And it's just become the assumed default position for many. And a lot of people are just of the mentality of, oh, yeah, we know that Catholicism and Orthodoxy aren't right. We don't even need to make the arguments anymore. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see so many people, I've seen so many people moving to these other traditions, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and others. So that's the second thing I noticed. The third thing I noticed is that there are a lot of caricatures of Catholicism and Orthodoxy. And so what happens is people have absorbed these caricatures. For example, that Roman Catholic Christians don't have a personal relationship with Christ, that there's no sense of that personal dimension, that they don't love the Bible, that they worship Mary, that there's no basis for their canon, for example. Just caricatures or overly simplified and not really accurate, the kind of thing that when you're talking to a thoughtful person from the other tradition, it quickly falls away and you realize, oh, it's a little more complicated. That's a problem. First of all, there's a moral consideration. Caricaturing is one form of violating the ninth commandment. We want to tell the truth and represent. If you read the Westminster Confession on its explication of the ninth commandment, it's very thorough. We want to fully represent others accurately. So that's a problem, but it's also a problem from a pragmatic standpoint, in that people who have absorbed all these caricatures of Catholicism or Orthodoxy their whole life, suddenly they're seeing these really thoughtful, winsome people on YouTube articulating a Catholic point of view, and it's like the massive pendulum swing. And I've just seen that over and over again, where people go from don't give it the time of day to converting. So I'm burdened about that. The fourth thing and final thing I've noticed in my YouTube career is that there's lots of caricatures of Protestants, even among Protestants as well. And I think these four things combine to create a dynamic in which many people right now are moving from Protestant to Catholic or Orthodox. Now, the way I approach these conversations is more irenic. That's both, again, a pragmatic and a moral consideration. I think that's what Christ would call us towards. I also think it's just more effective right now. And so I don't take the approach of, throwing down the gauntlet to attack these other traditions. I think we can learn from them. I think we have common ground with them on many points. On the other hand, there's another extreme we could default towards, where we act as though the differences aren't important and Protestantism isn't even worth defending. And I think that's a problem as well. I think it's worth defending Protestantism. Let me give two reasons additionally, but beyond that initial sketch of the lay of the land, for why I think there's a lot of conversions to Catholicism and Orthodoxy now. And then we'll get into some of the specific questions to talk through. One is I do think there's a lot of shallowness in contemporary evangelical churches. And I can't speak to the situation in Sweden or Europe generally as much, but I know in the United States, take the issue of the sacraments, for example. There's lots of non-denominational churches that really have a low view of the sacraments, so that even though it's not necessary to Protestantism that we downplay the sacraments, perhaps not even calling them sacraments, and even though the Reformation was, among other things, an attempt to restore the Eucharist to a central role that has ongoing vitality for Christians, whereas it had been really sidelined and people actually eating the bread and drinking the wine regularly. And we can talk about that. Today, a lot of people, the practice is so bad that a lot of people literally have the idea that it's like, well, Catholics have a high view of the sacraments, Protestants have a low view. And you hear these ways of thinking, you're thinking, oh my goodness, we really need to retrieve historic Protestant practices. And we could talk about many other examples of that. General liturgical practices, for example. So that's one factor. I think that I have a real heart to help Protestants beef up their theology in many ways. Our just general historical, our knowledge of church history, be another example. The second factor is I think that right now there's a cultural dynamic here as we are in the late modern West, where part of the ethos of modernity is a sense of emancipation from the past and individualism. And I think there's very understandably a reaction against that. So, you can picture someone who's grown up going to a megachurch that doesn't have any sort of historical awareness, doesn't have any sort of liturgical or sacramental depth. And meanwhile, they're sort of, they're sort of turned off by the super sort of seeker-friendly appeal of that particular church. And at the same time, they're feeling this deep ache and loneliness and sense of being cut off from the past. And so a part of the powerful allure of these traditions, like Catholicism and Orthodoxy, is they offer this sense of being connected to what is ancient, this deep sense of historical continuity. And I think that's another factor in why so many, and I don't think it's going to slow down. I think we've got to wake up to these conversations and really engage them, because I don't think this is going to stop happening. I think we're going to keep seeing people moving to Catholicism and Orthodoxy. And so I have a deep passion in my heart that with having a respectful attitude towards Christians in those traditions, we can nonetheless give a winsome and positive and clear and compelling defense of Protestantism, because I think it is a very noble position and a reasonable position, and a lowercase c Catholic position. I also think we can seek to be deep in history and meet those needs without leaving Protestantism. I think really what we need to do is to a large degree simply retrieve historic Protestant practices and mentalities, because today contemporary Protestants have often drifted from our roots. So in other words, I don't think you need to become Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox or Oriental Orthodox or Assyrian Church of the East or whatever in order to be rooted in ancient Christianity. I believe with all of my heart that you can be rooted in ancient Christianity as a Protestant. In fact, I think you can do it better as a Protestant. So let me speak to that a little bit. I'll just develop a few bullet points here, a few comments to that end, so that we can, and what I'll do is here, what I'd like to do is highlight 4 areas to address that I think are 4 of the cardinal issues in these conversations that are helpful to touch upon, and that will be 4 chapters in the book I'm hoping to start writing this summer. The first is just a general understanding of what Protestantism is. I think Protestantism is often misunderstood. There are many ways that happens, but the biggest one perhaps is related to Newman's comment, Cardinal Newman's comment. I'm sure you've heard this, that to be deep in history is to cease to be a Protestant. Well, that's a common sentiment, and one of the reasons why people find that compelling is, number one, sort of superficial points of connection between the ancient church and contemporary practices. But more deeply, I think people have a caricature of Protestantism as though it were starting a new church. I hear language like this all the time. My church was founded by Jesus Christ. Your church was founded by Martin Luther, or whoever it may be. I'm part of the Catholic Church. You're part of the Lutheran Church, for example, language like this. And in general, even many Protestants don't, going back to those issues of continuity and discontinuity throughout church history, a lot of Protestants don't really understand what the Reformation was. It was in no way an effort to start a new church or to kind of cut off from the ancient church or something like that. On the contrary, the whole impetus was, among other things, Catholicity. The Reformers built their case not just on the Bible, though they did that as well. They also built it upon the testimony of the church fathers. And they were saying there are, I think William Perkins is one in the Reformed tradition who says, we reject nothing that is of the substance of the Christian faith. We're simply pairing off novel abuses. Let me give a few examples of this just to buttress this point, because people often don't realize this. Here's how John Calvin put it in a debate in 1539 with a Roman Catholic opponent. He said, quote, "Our agreement with antiquity is far greater than yours," speaking to his Catholic opponent. "All we have attempted to do is renew the ancient form of the church that existed in the age of Chrysostom and Basil among the Greeks, and Cyprian, Ambrose, and Augustine among the Latins." So you hear what he's saying there. He's saying basically, all we're trying to do is go back to the purity of the 4th and 5th centuries. That's around that time. Here's a statement from Martin Luther writing in the 1530s, and he's criticizing the Church of Rome. But then he says, "Today we still call the Church of Rome holy, and all its sees holy. Even though they have been undermined and their ministers are ungodly, it is still the church. Although the city of Rome is worse than Sodom and Gomorrah, nevertheless, there remains in it baptism, the sacrament, the voice and text of the gospel, the sacred scriptures, the ministries, the name of Christ, and the name of God. Therefore, the Church of Rome is holy." These quotes are from my book, Theological Retrieval for Evangelicals. And what I do there is then I canvass historic Protestant ways of countering the charge of novelty. The Roman Catholic opponents were saying, you guys, we're old and you're new. And the second generation and third generation Protestants developed very sophisticated ways of responding to that almost no Protestants talk about today. Francis Turretin, for example, was making this case of, first of all, he's saying, no, we are even more ancient. And he's pointing to particular practices. He's pointing to particular separatist groups like Jan Hus, sometimes pronounced John Huss, and his followers, the Waldensians, John Wycliffe. There's actually many, many others besides those three are the best known. But also, Turretin was pointing to, he said, our church was in the papacy itself. He's appealing to this notion of a remnant. He's saying, we're not starting over. We're not starting a new church. The church has always been there. In other words, there's a more lowercase c Catholic mindset to recognize that the church can exist within Roman Catholicism. There are Christians in there. They've been baptized. They know Christ. But they were saying that there's been dreadful errors that have crept in, and we're trying to take off the errors. If people understand that that's what Protestantism is, a lot of these charges about Protestantism being new and novel will fall away. What I am going to do in my book and what I do in my videos on Truth Unites is basically go through particular issues and try to rebut Newman's claim that to be deep in history is to cease to be a Protestant. It's complicated. There are issues where particular Catholic beliefs, Orthodox beliefs that are often, though not always opposed by Protestants, do have great ancient pedigree. One example of where they can build a strong case against us on historical grounds would be praying to prayers for the dead. You find a pretty, you can go back to the 2nd century and find testimony of that. Not to say it's never controversial or anything, but on most of the issues, I'm convinced that where Protestants will differ from our Catholic and Orthodox friends, a good case can be made that the particular belief in question, affirmed by the Catholic or Orthodox side, is an accretion. I use that word. An accretion is a slow, gradual buildup. And I argue that, so I go through in my videos, I talk about the Marian dogmas, and I've made a case of trying to chart out where you see these developing throughout the patristic era. And related to the dogmas would be the practice of praying to Mary. And you see that starting in around the mid 3rd century, but you got major Christians like Chrysostom and Augustine and others who don't ever pray to Mary well after that. So it's sort of gradually kind of coming in, but and then with the dogmas, it's not just because they'll charge us with making arguments from silence, but it's not just silence, it's the counter testimonies. It's like the Immaculate Conception of Mary. It's all the fathers early on seeming to assume or assert that Mary was sinful and sinned at times. Or with the bodily assumption, Epiphanius in the 4th century, 5th century, sometime in there, has a counter testimony to that. So this is a lot of what I'm trying to do in my videos, is say, no, Newman is wrong. To be deep in history does not take you away from Protestant views. It depends on where you go back, on which issue it is. But in many cases, a good case can be made that the Catholic and Orthodox views are accretions. I've made similar arguments with respect to venerating icons, particularly in dialogue with the Orthodox tradition. I believe that's an accretion. I don't think that's well represented in the first 300 years of church history, and I think it's very controversial in the next 300 years of church history. It's kind of a power struggle back and forth before that is ultimately affirmed at the Seventh Ecumenical Council. And even after that council, there's long traditions of dissent. With regard to relics and purgatory, I've put out videos trying to trace out the development, trying to show kind of when and where things come into the mix. And I'm happy to recount that here to whatever extent that'd be helpful for folks, or they could go watch the videos. With regard to indulgences, I've tried to draw attention to the difference between patristic indulgences and medieval indulgences, and they are so different that the word indulgences should hardly be used for both. With regard to praying to the saints, I've argued that you don't really see that practice well attested in the first 200 years of church history, and it's sort of gradually growing as you get there, but that the patristic practice of praying to the saints is very mild compared to the kind of liturgical prayers to Mary and others you're seeing circulated in the medieval era. So all of that is to say, where the Protestant reformers were opposing certain beliefs that had come into the thought and practice and piety of the church, they argued for that. And we should argue for that as Protestants, not merely on the basis of Scripture, that we should do that as well, but also we should engage in church history. And I think a truly open-minded, thorough engagement in church history supports these Protestant concerns. There's lots else that we could say about that. One of the things I've also found helpful in that connection is talking about the Old Testament, because sometimes our Catholic and Orthodox friends will appeal to Matthew 16, where Jesus says, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, seeming to derive from this verse the idea that errors can't come into the church. And I think it's helpful to just draw attention to the specific language and what Jesus actually says there, which does not imply that there will be no errors. And then pointing to the Old Testament, we can see that God makes many exalted promises to the nation of Israel, but that does not prohibit idolatry from continually creeping in throughout the history of the Old Testament. I also think I'll say one other thing about this first question of can Protestants be deep in history? I think a very fruitful area of research is in what is called the Proto-Protestant Groups. And if anyone out there would like to enter into these discussions and make a contribution, let me encourage them that this might be a really fruitful area to consider. The Proto-Protestant groups are groups that arise prior to the 16th century that anticipate Protestant concerns to some extent or another, in some cases to a great extent, and in some cases they'll officially join with particular Protestant churches after the Reformation. That's true with respect to the Waldensians, for example. I think I mentioned the Hussites and the Lollards as well, two other groups. some of these groups have a lot of continuity with Protestant concerns with respect to transubstantiation, with respect to clerical abuse and papal abuse, with respect to indulgences, many other points. And so when the claim is leveraged against us that Protestant concerns sort of arose in the 16th century, or that this was some new thing, I think we can and should protest that no, this is the one moment in a longer tradition of dissent and expression of concern. And many of these groups were tragically, brutally persecuted. The Hussites are, I've read a couple of the biographies of Hus, we should technically pronounce it, Jan Hus, in Bohemia. And he was a pretty incredible man of God, and he was burned alive. He was burned at the stake, despite having enormous continuity with a lot of Catholic views, but just for his protests against papal abuses, clerical abuses, indulgences, and other things. And he is not alone. There's lots of examples like that. So all of that, that's another important piece of this discussion. So all of that is to say, I would just like to offer my encouragement to other Protestants to continue to press into church history as Protestants. I think we need that, and I think it will help us express Protestant beliefs. All right, let me address a second area that I think is very important in dialogue with our Catholic friends particularly, and that is the issue of the papacy. Very frequently, when one gets into the other particular differences, such as the Marian dogmas, the discussion ultimately terminates into questions that land upon the papacy. They get to questions of authority and methodology. And very often we're told that as Protestants, we're just sort of picking and choosing, and we're making ourselves into our own pope and all these kinds of charges, which I actually think are very unfair. But very often we're sort of, we're told that these are basically just methodological issues, the reason why we shouldn't be looking back as an individual to the annals of history and sort of the archaeological data of what we see in church history, because we don't have exhaustive records. And really we need some sort of, we'll be told this is precisely why we need an authoritative magisterium to make these judgment calls for us. And oftentimes there's this, what I regard as an unfair framing of a contrast between corporate versus individual, as though the Catholic has a sort of corporate identity and the Protestant is sort of on their own, which is not really accurate and not where the difference lies. But at any rate, a lot of the discussion, like with the Marian dogmas, when you make the case that, look, these things just look like accretions, they don't look like they go back to the apostolic deposit in the first century. A lot of times the counter argument will ultimately basically come down to, well, what authority do you have to make that determination? And if Christ established a visible church that has this particular hierarchical structure, then we need to trust that that church won't lead us into error. Okay, these kinds of appeals. And because that's sort of a hinge issue in, just determining which way so many other issues will go, I think it's really important for Protestants who seek to be deep in history while maintaining a Protestant identity to engage the issue of the papacy and make from a biblical and historical standpoint. So one of the areas I put a lot of research into is looking into the papacy, both from a biblical standpoint and from a historical standpoint. If someone would like to hear my case on that a bit more fully, I gave a 20-minute overview of that, followed by some Q&A. And beforehand, there was some Q&A too on Cameron Bertuzzi's channel, Capturing Christianity, about 3 weeks ago. I think it was late March. And so you could go and I think it's just called The Case Against the Papacy. And so you could search for that on YouTube on Capturing Christianity and see my case there. And there's been maybe 9 or so responses from Catholic apologists to that video. And so I've put out one follow-up response video. These are very live conversations. My response video came out like 4 days ago. So you can see that as the most recent video on my channel, where I think that one is entitled something like My Case Against the Papacy, Response to Criticism. So The papacy is just a cardinal issue. It's just so important. Now, a few general reflections here. One will be that I think we will be helped to listen to the criticisms of our Eastern Orthodox friends as well, because as well as other traditions, we sometimes it's always narrowed down to Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, but we don't want to leave off the other Eastern traditions, the Coptic churches, and then also the churches that split off at Vatican I, the old Catholic Church, because of Vatican I. So it's not just so. In other words, it's helpful. Sometimes it can be this game of cat and mouse where people will frame things as though you're just this tiny little Protestant on your own. Who are you? And then there's the church. And I think it's helpful to recognize when Protestants are not alone in a particular criticism. And so as we're engaging in a sort of ecumenical dialogue, we can recognize the papacy has been a sticking point pretty much all the way around. Perhaps we might say the sticking point in ecumenical dialogue between the East and the West, and then between various dissenting Western churches and the Roman Church. So that helps to know that and to consider those criticisms. And another general comment I would have on this issue is that it's very helpful as we go back throughout church history to try to make careful distinctions that accurately frame where the real differences are. Oftentimes it will be framed as though, Peter has a leadership role, therefore the papacy, or the Church of Rome in the 2nd century, 3rd century, whenever, has a kind of primacy and preeminence, therefore the papacy. And people are swayed by these arguments. But this is where listening to our Eastern Orthodox friends, for example, can help us understand, well, actually, that doesn't follow. The papacy is a very specific office that has been defined at Vatican I as involving succession, so from Peter to Roman bishops, supremacy, and that means that Peter has greater authority. He has a sort of immediate and universal jurisdiction over the church. There's a very particular kind of authority. So that means Peter is like the top guy in a hierarchy. And infallibility. So general stature in the Church of Rome, or a general leadership role for Peter in the New Testament, doesn't result in that. And I think it's just helpful to try to accurately frame where we actually disagree, because as Protestants and as these other traditions, we can agree that the Church of Rome was a preeminent church in the early centuries of the church. And we can agree that Peter was a leader among the apostles. But that doesn't really settle anything. Then that just starts the conversation to ask, what kind of leadership, what kind of preeminence? Is it Vatican I? Is it that vision particularly? And I find that helpful and to frame things like that. And then I would just say I've made the case and worked through it in pretty great detail, just working through the New Testament, working through Matthew 16, working through the other texts, and then working through the relevant evidence from early church history as well, which I think is helpful to put in combination with that to protect yourself from various counter arguments that will be made. And I think both biblically and historically, a very solid case can be made against the papacy. It really doesn't have good attestation. And so people have to stretch things to try to make it work. I think it's totally fair for us to just point that out. Say, look, you're getting things from these texts that are not natural or clear implications from them. And the idea of a supreme infallible head on top of the church early on, I mean, another thing we can do, by the way, is just appeal to the Catholic scholars. It's pretty much a consensus among the scholars that there's not even any single bishop in Rome early on until you get into the 100s a bit, let alone a supreme head over the whole church who's a single bishop in Rome. So I think, being aware that that's pretty standard even among Roman Catholic scholars is helpful for us as we make a case like that. All right, next issue I want to touch upon and kind of just flag for attention, and then we can drill down into any of these more fully as we get into the Q&A, is Sola Scriptura. This is one of the 5 solas, and I would have to say that this may be along with sola fide, it may be the single most caricatured doctrine of Protestantism. And so I think, and a lot of Protestants don't necessarily understand it very clearly either. And so this is one of those areas where I think it will be really helpful for us to just have some precision and carefulness about what sola scriptura is. So the definition that I employ is the only infallible rule. Scripture is the only infallible rule for faith and practice for the church as such. Let me just unpack that. Only infallible rule. Those words are very important because sola scriptura will often be caricatured as only rule, as though we don't believe in like authoritative doctrinal standards at all. And it's kind of like, well, also what we need to do is look at the Protestant traditions and the doctrinal standards we have to see, well, we believe in those. We just don't think they're infallible. And yet people say that all the time. Also, only infallible rule is different from exclusive source. People will all the time caricature sola scriptura as though it were the idea that all our doctrines have to come out of the Bible. No, it doesn't mean that. You might believe something based upon your conscience. You might believe something based on general revelation. You might believe something based upon reason. You might believe something based upon experience or tradition. All we're saying is those things aren't infallible rules. Okay. Another part of the definition that's important is for the church's faith and life, only infallible rule for faith and practice. So it's not for all that we might believe. The Bible is not the only infallible rule for chemistry or for geometry. It will be maybe relevant to how we approach those disciplines, but it's not really a rule for them. And then lastly, for the church as such, we're not saying that if God, that if an apostle, if you live in Thessalonica in the year 98 AD, and an apostle has let you remember 30 years ago, the apostles left with you a particular tradition that wouldn't be binding or authoritative. We're talking about a conceptual schema for the church as such, that is for the whole church. Just as a Catholic could acknowledge that if a particular individual is on a desert island and God speaks to them and shows up and does something to them, that's fine. It's not really a defeater for the general schema of how we understand church and tradition and how they relate, and how we how we understand the nature of the Word of God. So that's just an important point as well, because what people will do is they'll say, look, there's oral tradition mentioned in the Bible, therefore sola scriptura is false, as though that were a problem for sola scriptura. I find this happens over and over where people just don't have a sympathetic understanding of sola scriptura. They're not trying to understand it on its own terms. They continually reduce it, simplify it, caricature it. And so I think that's one of those key areas where we will need to be prepared for those caricatures. We will need to be prepared to help people understand what it means. Doesn't mean it's not the same thing as the sufficiency of Scripture, for example. Some Reformed Christians believe in the sufficiency of Scripture. That's another thing people will do, is they'll mush together sola scriptura with other things, like maybe the perspicuity of Scripture or other aspects, or the sufficiency, other aspects of a Protestant view of Scripture that aren't the same thing. And not all Protestants who affirm sola scriptura affirm the sufficiency or perspicuity of Scripture. So they're just different. And so people will mush them together. So those are all some thoughts about why that is just such an important area for us to cover, why that's such an important area for us to review. I'm going quickly because I want to finish off so that we have most of our time for Q&A, or lots of time for Q&A. So in fact, let me just kind of finish by just mentioning sola fide. This is another area where I think issues of sola fide, that is by faith alone, I think this is an area where there's lots of need for work for two reasons. One is that the issues of justification. So one is that there's lots of caricatures on this as well. You'll over and over hear other traditions speak of sola fide as though it meant it doesn't matter how you live. You can just easy believism. You just say a sinner's prayer and you're good. And of course, that is a caricature of the Protestant view. The Protestant reformers all insisted upon the necessity of good works. If you have true faith, unless you die right away and don't have time to evidence it, your changed heart will result in changed behavior. And Luther, like we can put the quotes as blunt as this. Luther said, good works are not the cause of salvation, but they are necessary for salvation. That's pretty clear. Calvin, similar things. So over and over, sola fide is caricatured. All sola fide means is that faith alone is the instrumental means by which we are actually made right in the sight of God. Our works don't actually make us right, but that will then result in works is also part of the historic Protestant view. Again, a lot of Protestants don't necessarily understand that. But the second reason why sola fide is an important issue for us to engage in as we seek to be deep in history is that the area of justification was one of the sparks of the Reformation, and between Catholic and Protestant in particular, it's one of those areas where perhaps we can make some progress. And I've put out a video on justification arguing that we have some important areas of difference, but we do have some areas where we maybe have misunderstood each other, and we can see that we're not as different as some have thought. So, for example, I know that this may be controversial, but some take the view that the Roman Catholic teaching is a false gospel, therefore it's a false church. It's just like the Judaizers Paul was opposing in Galatians. And I'm not persuaded of that. I think there are differences. I worry about that view. I think it would require us to ultimately anathematize Augustine, because Augustine had a very similar view to the contemporary Roman Catholic Church. He defined, the big thing here is that we just simply define the word justification differently. Catholics, by that term, mean they include what we call sanctification. They mean the whole process of actually changing, moral transformation, whereas we think of it as a forensic declaration and distinguish that from sanctification. And so it's just important to be aware we're using terms differently there. And sometimes our differences are seen to be greater than they actually are because of the different terminology. And Catholics do at their best. They do distinguish initial justification, which is by grace, from final justification. So we need to be aware of some of those nuances as we work through this. And that's not to say there's no important differences remaining, but we just want to be as accurate as we can be there. Let me just conclude my comments by giving a few practical tips. Suppose Protestants want to be deep in history. What should we do? Well, I've written a blog post that is 5 books to, I think it's entitled 5 books from the Church Fathers to read, something like that. And I just recount 5 examples. I think there are some, my main piece of advice is simply to dive into the historic texts. Sometimes people feel intimidated by that and they want to start with the secondary literature. And I understand that, but I actually think most people won't find these church fathers as difficult to read as you'd expect. There will be moments where it's kind of like, wow, they're just thinking so differently. But, and Martin, I think, is putting that into the chat. Yes, that's it right there. 5 books to read by church fathers. Thanks, Martin, for posting that. And someone's also posted my YouTube channel. That's great. Thank you. So that there's some starting points, and I really love to encourage people to dive in and read Irenaeus's. He's got a book of catechetical instruction that's really clear, short. It's relatively easy to read. It gets you into the patristic mindset a bit. I love to encourage Athanasius's On the Incarnation of the Word. That's a wonderful book, which is, you could read it in one sitting. It's not lengthy, and it gets you into so many interesting issues of atonement theory, the nature of the incarnation, the nature of Christ, so much. It's helpful. Cyril of Jerusalem's Catechetical Lectures. Again, it's just one of those easy to access texts because it's catechetical lectures for baptizans, people about to be baptized. So it's deliberately written in a way to kind of give you an overview of what you need to know to be baptized. And so it is clear and fascinating. He's also a really interesting thinker at an interesting time, writing in Jerusalem, 4th century. So he's one I love to encourage. Of course, Augustine and Augustine's Confessions are a great starting point. Every Christian should read Augustine's Confessions at some point. They're so rich spiritually and theologically and literarily. They're just an amazing piece of literature. And I can give some other suggestions as well, but I think Protestantism will be well served if more Protestants are deeply engaging in church history. I think that will help us defend Protestantism. And I also just think it will help us live out Protestantism in such a way that people will just naturally understand the Protestant mentality historically better. So that's my kind of final appeal there. But let me draw to a close there, and so we can have time for Q&A, because I really wanted to save some time for that.
Thank you so much, Gavin. This was very helpful to have this sort of, as you said, flagged for attention, all these different areas and issues that we could go ahead and explore a little further now during the Q&A. All right. Are you ready to get going, Gavin?
Sure. Sounds good.
All right. Okay, cool. Here we go. Hi, Dr. Ortland. My question is if you have read Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. In that case, could you quickly give me some of your thoughts on the book? If not, it's a friend who's Syrian who's just gone from the Pentecostal church to the Orthodox church because of, he has a friend who is a Syrian who's just gone from the Pentecostal church to the Orthodox church because of this book. How do you think I should meet people like my friend when it comes to church history?
Okay. Yeah, thanks for the question. I have not read that particular book. I was just looking it up, and I'm familiar with the author, but I have not read that book. So I can't speak to that specific book. I can say, of course, that, I've seen so many friends make a similar movement, so many others make a similar movement from low church to orthodoxy. I think one of the appeals of orthodoxy is the practical point that it doesn't have as much history with Protestantism, and therefore there's not as much baggage. Some people have a very negative feeling about Catholicism because of our shared history and because they've grown up being familiar with it or whatever. And many people have simply either never heard of Orthodoxy or they know nothing about it. And you don't have some of the same sticking points. Two of the things that Protestants often react with concern to in the Catholic tradition would be indulgences and the papacy. Well, you don't have those sticking points in Orthodoxy. To speak to how should I meet my friend, I would encourage the consideration of other aspects that are unique to Orthodoxy. And one of them would be the issue of venerating icons. This is one of the reasons, this would be one of the areas where I have concern about Orthodox teaching and practice, because I feel very strongly, and I think a very, very compelling case can be made that the practice of venerating icons is not apostolic. I don't think that the evidence for that is good at all. I think it is very poor in terms of its biblical and early church historical attestation. Many Christians early on just say, they say, number one, it's a distinctive feature of Christian worship to not engage in this practice, which is common in the pagan territories around, but also we don't even use images for any reason in our churches. You can, I've put out a video chronicling some of the statements to that effect from Origen and others. And then you get into, after the conversion of Constantine, there's a sudden accumulation of wealth in the church, and you do start to see images used, but oftentimes it's for teaching purposes, not for venerating, i.e. bowing down, kissing, etc. And then eventually you see at the Seventh Ecumenical Council, it's a vicious back and forth power struggle. And there's even waves of iconoclasm, which is the view of those who reject venerating icons after that. And then in the West, for long periods of time, into like the 1100s, it remains illegal in various places to use images in that way in churches. So I think people should understand that when we speak of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, we mean the word ecumenical in the technical sense. We don't mean on the ground everywhere. Like all Christians are good with venerating icons. It was incredibly controversial and bloody. I mean, back and forth. So I'll simply say, I think that would be one example of an area that might be helpful for someone to engage, to say, look, this really looks like an accretion. This really looks like an innovation. This really looks like a later development that we don't have any attestation for in the first 300 or so years of church history. And in fact, pretty uniform testimony against in that span of time. And I think that that's a reasonable argument to make, because the Orthodox tradition will respect tradition. They're bound to that. So they can't say, oh, well, that's not a problem. They have to engage that data. And I think the data is against their view on that issue. So that's one example of an area that might be helpful to engage.
Thank you. Okay, here's a long one from Gabriel. Hello, Dr. Ortland. I'm currently struggling with my faith, or more precisely, my Christian walk, due to Cameron Bertuzzi's apparent conversion to Catholicism, because to me, the papacy being true does have terrifying consequences. It seems the Bible teaches sola fide, but the Catholic Church does not. And if the Catholic Church is right, wouldn't that mean that most Protestants are damned? I know you don't think that Catholics are damned if sola fide is true, but a lot of Catholics do think the reverse if the papacy is true. Also, do you have any recommendations for good books on the case against the papacy, church history, and sola scriptura? God bless.
Thank you so much, Gabriel, for that great question. I really resonate with, I think a lot of people have been following Cameron's development, and it can be very unsettling for people. So I really understand where this question is coming from. Let me speak to it a few points. First, I don't think it necessarily is the case that if the Catholic Church is the one true church, most Protestants are damned. That will depend upon which Catholic you're talking to, but the official Catholic teaching since Vatican II is much more open to that, to Protestants being saved. So that's just a point of, I don't know what that might necessarily entail for you, but just to be accurate about that, I mean, the Vatican II is pretty clear that there were separated brethren, and it's at least possible for people outside of the Catholic Church to be saved. Now, whether that's consistent with historic Catholic claims is another matter, and I'm persuaded it is not. Let's see. My encouragement pastorally for this question, for all of us who might struggle with this, is we must place our full weight of confidence and trust in Jesus Christ personally, not am I in the right church? And this is one of the, in my mind, strengths of Protestantism, is this focus. I do think other traditions can and sometimes do make an idol out of the church. We make the church the guarantor or provider or dispenser of salvation, rather than the arena of salvation. The church is where we receive salvation, but it's not the case that, like, what I believe with all of my heart, based upon, I think, a sound basis in the New Testament, is that anyone who comes personally to Christ, repents of their sin, trusts in Christ for salvation, and seeks with all of their heart to follow him, which will mean being involved in the church, will be saved. And Christ will not say to them, despite your best sincere efforts to follow me, you weren't in the right canonical boundaries of the right church, therefore you're damned to hell. I just do not believe that. And I do think that belief undermines the confidence and assurance that the gospel of Jesus Christ is designed to give us. So I want us to just fully put our trust in Christ. So that'd be my pastoral advice. And then I would just keep, in addition to that, I'd say keep working through the issues. And I would say that I don't think we need to worry too much if the papacy is true, because honestly, the evidence for it is very poor. There's kind of a vacuum there at the beginning of the Christian church. It just, I think even most Catholic scholars will admit there wasn't even a bishop in Rome, a single bishop in Rome, until well into the 100s, let alone a supreme infallible head of the church who's the bishop there. So I just would want to reassure them too that they're in good standing, evidentially. Lastly, with respect to the question about book recommendations, unfortunately, there's less in this area. I can say Jerry Walls and another person whose name is not coming to me have written a book called, and the title's not going to come to me either, though it's right over my shoulder. It's a purple book by Baker Academic that came out about 10 years ago. Roman Catholic, but not Roman, Roman, but not Catholic, something like that. someone can put it into the chat box. That's a good book. It works through all the issues. That might be helpful. I also recommend the older treatments, Francis Turretin's Volume 3 of his Institutes of Elenctic Theology. It's not as hard to read as you'd expect. It's really good. And then I'm writing my book, and I hope that will be helpful as well. I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in, so I'll draw my answer to a close there.
Thank you. That's great. I put a link to that book, just the Amazon URL, the Catholic but not Roman book by Waltz, in the chat. So that's great. Thank you. Let's move on. Okay, could you give your thoughts on theosis, making divine? It's a transformative process whose aim is likeness to or union with God. Is this not more like salvation by works?
Okay. I'll give a briefer rendition here for people wanting a fuller answer. The first chapter in my book, Retrieving Augustine's Doctrine of Creation, has a section on theosis, or deification, in the thought of Augustine, where I speak to it from that angle. And for anyone watching along, that means the process of being made like God, participating in God, can be expressed in different ways. It's one way of understanding salvation. I don't think that theosis is necessarily works righteousness. Of course, it could be construed in such a way, but I'm not persuaded that that's necessarily the case. It seems to me sort of two separate issues. You know, theosis has to do with the nature of salvation. What is it to be saved? Works righteousness questions have to do with the means of salvation. How do we get it? So you could believe in theosis by total grace. You could just believe God, you know, gives you grace, and that's how it happens. So I don't think that. I also would want to say an additional corollary, kind of supplemental comment. Theosis is not outside of the Protestant tradition. Many Protestants believe in theosis. It's a common Protestant view. This is one of those many areas where a lot of times people are not as aware of kind of the best of Protestant theology throughout history. So, you know, you can find it all throughout. C.S. Lewis talks all the time about, you know, and I think theosis is one of those things that's often misunderstood, as though it meant we're obliterating the creator-creation distinction. We're being made God himself. But that's never what the fathers mean by it. That's not what Athanasius and Augustine, I mean, it's pretty common throughout the fathers. What they're talking about is more in the realm of 2 Peter, is it 2 Peter 1:4 or 1:6? I can't recall the verse, but it's being made partakers of the divine nature. Another way of thinking about it actually is the nature of the resurrection body. And also another angle of approach to get into it would be the Beatific Vision, which means the sight of God in heaven, which is something I've written on. So I would actually want to say that I think as Protestants, we can fully embrace the basic idea that we will participate in God. His life will flow into us in some profound way. And then the question is, well, how do we understand that precisely, and how do we explain that? But I think we've got a biblical basis, and I think we've got it's a strong lowercase c Catholic idea. So I think we can affirm that, and then the question will just be, how do we understand that responsibly and well? And that's an important conversation. Hope that helps.
Great, thank you. Okay, from Hannah. I have a friend who says the Protestant Church is a failure because it is so divided, whereas the Catholic Church is united. How would you answer that claim?
Okay, I would say two things. Number one, and we do hear this charge a lot, and sometimes the numbers are greatly inflated. People will say there are 33,000 Protestant denominations. That number has been thoroughly debunked. There are not 33,000. The same figure, the same means of calculating the word denomination that leads to that statistic teaches you that there's multiple Roman Catholic denominations. Okay, so they use the word denomination to refer to if there's like the same church in two different regions, they'll call that two different denominations and so forth. So they greatly inflate them. The numbers are much smaller. But leaving that point aside, I think it's helpful to reflect upon the nature of unity. What is unity? If one says that the Catholic Church has unity, Protestants don't, we immediately note that within the Catholic Church, you can find arch traditionalists who think that the Catholic Church went off the rails at Vatican II and compromised, and so The vast majority of Catholics aren't even, on the right track. And then you can find radical progressives, so you can find a full gambit. So unity there in every church falls short of what Christ would fully want in his prayer in John 17. Moreover, while Protestant churches often have an institutional separation, we actually can still have great amounts of unity. They're not full unity, but we still have a lot of unity. All the other churches in the Ojai Valley at Good Friday 5 nights ago, last Friday night, put on a Good Friday service together, a joint Good Friday service. And it was wonderful. It was glorious. I mean, at the end of the service, we're all up there on the stage praying together and asking God to bring revival to Ojai. It's wonderful. We all see each other as the church. We're all part of the church. And so what you really get to is two different. So that's the first point, is unity is more than institutional overhead. Unity is more than just having some guy at the top that says you're within the same canonical boundaries. There's so much more to it. You can have a lot of disunity while having that, and you can have a lot of unity without having that. I hope I said that right. The second thing to say is, well, unity with whom? So we have to probe the nature of who are those people we need to have unity with. The case can be made that the Catholic Church has disunity with the fullness of the church because her claims have caused separations with the old Catholic Christians, with the Eastern Orthodox traditions, with other separatist groups, with the Protestant groups. You see, they're claiming unity because they have unity with themselves. It's easy to have unity if you just define it as everyone who agrees under our boundaries. But they don't have unity with the Eastern Orthodox. They don't have unity with the Lutherans. They don't have unity with the Anglicans. So the charges are greatly inflated on this. And that's another point I think it's helpful to bring out. And I would say that I think the papacy is the greatest barrier, the top barrier to ecumenical progress. I don't know how we're ever going to come together so long as Vatican I is saying that the Bishop of Rome has immediate and universal jurisdiction, and all the other bishops relate to him by the duty of hierarchical subordination and true obedience. That's the language of Vatican I. So he's claiming this massive, gargantuan amount of authority that's not authentic to how the church functioned in the first millennium. And so that's going to be a major barrier to unity. So I think I would flip this question and see it in reverse. I think more work needs to be done by our Catholic friends before we would ever be able to start to come closer together for a fullness of unity. But at the same time, we also need to always guard our own hearts to say, where can I make my contribution within my placement?
Great, thanks. Question from Jemima. Judaism seems to be a popular alternative theology in Sweden. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, how interesting. I don't see that as much in my context. For a question like that, it would seem to me that going straight to Jesus is the best approach, and making a case for his resurrection, making a case for, in my book, I give an amended version of C.S. Lewis's Lord Liar Lunatic argument, adding in the possibility of legend and interacting with Bart Ehrman's scholarship on that. So Lord Liar Lunatic legend, just making the case that we have to find some way to understand this person. I think Jesus is incredibly compelling. So if I'm in a dialogue with someone that's outside of all the Christian traditions, they don't believe in a divine view of Jesus, they don't believe in the Trinity, they don't believe Jesus is God, but they do believe in God. So whether it's Judaism or Islam or other religions, I just find it helpful to go straight to Christ and allow his claims to kind of have the leverage, because he did claim to be God, and we've all got to find some way to work through that. And in my book, I make the argument more fully there, but that's how I would approach that conversation.
Thanks. Question from Stefan now. Do you have hope for real reform of the Roman Catholic Church? In one sense, their doctrinal system makes gradual inclusion of new elements, new emphasis, an option, but not the rejection of previous standpoints. What's your view on that?
Yeah. I don't think I can say I have great hope for real reform. I have hope that we can have positive relationships and friendships amidst our differences. I have hope that we can work together in relation to our areas of agreement, maybe on social issues, for example. We can be co-belligerents on social causes. Also, we have doctrinal points where we really agree, like the Trinity, and we can work together in relation to those areas. But if reform means a real substantive reform, it's possible. I pray for that, but I don't have great hope for it because of the trajectory. After the Protestant Reformation, the Council of Trent, from my vantage point, while it addressed a few errors and abuses, from my vantage point, doubled down to some extent on errors. And then you look at their recent trajectory, you know, the more recent dogmas would be papal infallibility and the Immaculate Conception and the bodily assumption of Mary, 1950. That's the most recent Catholic dogma. So this is not looking good. It does not look like we're trending toward Catholicity. It looks like we're concretizing and particularizing in these very specific ways with these dogmas that are really not lowercase c Catholic. So unfortunately, I don't think I can say I have great hope for that. But again, we can try to do everything we can do to maintain positive relations amidst those differences.
Speaking of orthodoxy, or perhaps rather in the context of the previous question, speaking of reforms, can you mention if there were any reform attempts within the East?
I don't have as much knowledge about that. I am aware that there are times in the East where you'll have a particular doctrinal dispute between, to use this language, a more conservative element and I don't want to call it a progressive element, but an element that may not be as rigidly tied to prior ways of thinking about a particular thing. So right now in my research, I'm doing some work on the essence energies distinction. And, you know, one of the things in there is the 4th century theologian, Gregory Palamas, who's significant for that doctrine, because orthodoxy distinguishes between the essence of God and the energies of God. To what extent is he in continuity with prior Orthodox theologians in the East? So that's a big question. So there's things like that. I am not aware of anything that's even remotely comparable to the Protestant Reformation in the East. I'm not aware of that. And I'm not saying there should have been at one particular time something like that exactly. I mean, the Reformation was caused by particular things, like some of which aren't in the East, like the papacy and indulgences, and a particular understanding of purgatory, and just a whole sort of meritorious and even financial system of how salvation is understood, particular abuses with the Eucharist. So there's certain things in the West that the Reformation was sparked by. So I'm not even saying there should have been in the same way, but I would just say I'm not aware of any. That's one of the appeals of Orthodoxy, is it does have just a greater level of continuity, it seems. So yeah, I'm not aware of any major kind of reform effort that would be comparable to like the Protestant Reformation, but there may be something and I'm just not aware of it.
Great. Question from Nicole. Scott Hahn recently said on Pints with Aquinas that the papacy is where Jesus restored the Davidic kingdom when building the church on Peter, connecting it with Isaiah 22. What is the Protestant view of Jesus restoring the Davidic kingdom? Is it a physical church or something else?
Yes, thank you, Nicole, for that question. I watched that video as well. I've been talking by phone and text and email with Cameron Bertuzzi, trying to be a help and a resource to him and his thought process about all of these things. So I watched that. I am thoroughly unpersuaded that the Davidic monarchy being instantiated by Jesus Christ is an argument for the papacy. I've addressed the argument from Isaiah 22 in my most recent video. My case against the papacy, response to criticism, I believe it's the 5th argument. I'm pretty sure it's the 5th argument. And I put timestamps in that video. So you could just go straight to the video, look at the timestamp number 5, typological arguments for papacy. And that's where I address this. And at greater length. More succinctly, I would just say, number 1, the difference is not whether or not we believe in a visible church. We all agree the church is visible. Sometimes Protestantism is caricatured as though we think the church is only invisible, something like this. Not at all true. The whole point of distinguishing with St. Augustine between the visible church and the invisible church is that you have them both. You just distinguish them. So what we do say is the church is not limited to one institution. But the whole idea, I just think it's extremely tendentious to try to get this one office, the steward office, from the Davidic monarchy, but leave all like the other like 18 offices that are mentioned in 1 Kings 4 as offices of the Davidic monarchy, and not see them as in the church. It's like, why are you choosing that one office, leaving all the others off? I think the usage of Isaiah 22 is extremely selective and arbitrary. We apply it to Matthew 16, but not to Revelation 3:7, which is a better parallel, talking about Jesus. Some aspects of that office are carried over, but not others. And the bottom line is that office, the steward office mentioned in Isaiah 22, was not supreme or infallible. It was not even a teaching office. It was not a priestly office. It looked nothing like the papacy. So even if you just gave the typology free reign to work however you want, it doesn't entail the consequent. It doesn't entail the papacy. So I think that's a really problematic argument that people have to rely on, because there's no clear evidence for the papacy in the New Testament.
Thanks. Okay. You mentioned that Augustine had a similar view as the Catholic Church regarding justification. Both Luther and Calvin were very eager to use Augustine in their arguments. Do you think they had Augustine on their side, or did they just use him to get extra authority in their arguments?
Good question. I think that the reformers were very right to draw attention to Augustine in various respects. He simply, Augustine wrote an enormous amount. And so there will just be some issues on which he will favor one side, other issues on which he favors the other. So the definition of justification, it is true that Augustine defined justification as actually making righteous, not just declaring righteous, so that it does involve the process, the transformative process that we would call sanctification as well. And that it influences the later development from him in the medieval tradition. So that's true. But on many other points, Augustine is a powerful testimony against Catholic claims. And I've argued for that with respect to sola scriptura. I think Augustine is pretty clear that even what he calls plenary councils, which would include ecumenical councils, can err. And scripture alone is infallible. So I've addressed that point in many videos. So Augustine is simply a mixed bag, but the reformers were certainly justified to point to those many areas of his thought that anticipate Reformation concerns.
Great. Well, we are coming up on time here, so I'm thinking let's do one final question. And we have one that's on the top of the pile here, and it happens to be a question from the director of our Institute, Apologia, Stefan. So he's very excited, obviously. Thanks, Gavin. You mentioned the difference between the view of indulgences in early church history compared to the later medieval period. Can you comment on that?
Okay, yes, and I'm hoping to do a video on this topic. So I'll try to put something like that out whenever I can. I think that I could just try to mention a few things, and I'm pulling up a document on my computer to make sure I don't forget any of them. So in the patristic era, there's various forms of penance that develop in the church for those who have sinned in a particularly severe way. So if someone renounces the faith during persecution, or if there's adultery, or if there's murder, or even you can find sins like bestiality or practicing divinization, some of these really severe. And you can read through the canons of some early synods to see what the particular forms of penance are for these. And some of them are extremely harsh. Like I remember one that I found is if you steal something from the church, you could be a penitent for 7 years. And so the church develops these various ways of kind of relaxing the canonical punishment that is stated there. But so in the patristic era, that's developed for very serious sins. Over time, it becomes more and more just a fundamental way of experiencing God's ongoing experience, of experiencing ongoing forgiveness and good standing with God. So that's one thing, is it just becomes much more ingrained in sort of common Christian experience, as opposed to this really high-handed sin, Another is, I think it starts to become more and more transactional. Initially, the whole point was to produce a genuine penitent heart in the person. And so you can understand, some of these early requirements in the patristic era. But over time, what happens is you get more possibility for positive acts to be done that have the same effect. So instead of, it becomes easier to bypass the stage of just having a penitent heart, and instead you go on this pilgrimage. I was just watching the movie Kingdom of Heaven. Remember that old movie? And he talks about, Orlando Bloom's character commits murder. And so he's talking about going to Jerusalem to get forgiveness of sins. And there's a lot of that in the medieval era. If I do this pilgrimage, if I touch this relic, if I pay this sum of money, and we all know how bad that gets. And by the time you get to the late medieval era in many places where it's just flat out financial manipulation of the laity, it's just not good. Another difference is the fathers generally didn't, I would argue that a lot of the fathers, this may not be true for everybody like Tertullian, but generally I don't think the church fathers thought of the relaxation of these canonical punishments as itself expiatory. That's what's forgiving the sin. I think for the most part, and also don't think you really have the idea of purgatory as systematically involved. I think that all kind of takes some time to develop. So in lots of ways, it just kind of grows and grows, and then, as we know, it just mushrooms up to the point where even those in the East are looking at this, just thinking this is not good. And I think even many of our Catholic friends would admit, like, there's pretty bad abuses going on by the time you get to Luther.
Well, great. Gavin, thank you so much for your time. It was wonderful to get to benefit from all your study on this topic. Obviously, you have lots more to say, but we've already mentioned your YouTube channel a fair bit. So check out Truth Unites. That's what you can search for on YouTube, Truth Unites. Or I think your website is just gavinortland.com, right?
Right.
So go there, everyone, if you want to continue to learn from Gavin on these or other topics. And yeah, we hope to see you physically present in Sweden at some point in the future.